I understood that Muslims come in different shades and shapes and understandings and theological convictions. And yes, I have my own convictions, but I'm not in a position to judge others. And I've been striving most of my life to make different kinds of Muslims speak to each other. I started also traveling around to Iran and to Malaysia and other places where I'm now making contact with the global Islamic community and beginning to understand a whole range of issues in context. So my life then turns into a life of scholarship together with the questions of the community. So one of the people whose work I'm also excited by, for some people he's very controversial. For me, he opens up a lot of conversations, is Muhammad Arkoon. The first book I bought was a translation, a section of إحياء with a red cover. But I started reading that book in English and I couldn't make much sense of it. But we don't look into Ghazali's emotional and spiritual life, his ups and downs. And if you don't understand Ghazali through his ups and downs and his complex spiritual life, you don't get Ghazali. He's psychologically ill, he says. He says he cannot move his tongue and he cannot really speak the way that he wants to speak. He's heavy-hearted. There's a certain kind of depression. For he says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَوْعِبْ بِهَذِهِ الْمُقَدِّمَةِ فَلَا ثِقَةَ فِي عِلْمِهِ أَصْلًا. That if you don't understand these questions of logic and propositions of language, then your knowledge cannot be trusted. So Ghazali is not rejecting philosophy. He's rejecting only some parts and some theories, but unfortunately a lot of people are arguing and making claims that Ghazali, is anti-philosophy. That's not true. لنور ألقى الله في قلبي. And what he does in إحياء علوم الدين is to bring what we call discursive knowledge into conversation with ethical knowledge of the heart. This book is about ilm al-muamala, and I'm now beginning to talk about ilm al-mukashafa. And I've been told and warned already that ifsha'u sirr rububiyyati kufrun. He realized the sacrality of knowledge, and he's asking himself, what am I doing here? Why am I putting my talents in the service of political authorities, which I'm not entirely sure if they are also all right? Al-firar min al-madrasa. Because Ghazali now tries to find his soul. And that he realized that the more I get involved in this political stuff, one, I'm not sure what this will result in. And secondly, he's also afraid of the assassin's dagger, that he could be next. But Ghazali did realize that I need to create a conversation between different Muslims, rather than them talk to each other than pointing their knives against each other. So therefore he wrote Faisalul Tafrika, Bain al-Islam. The whole project is about adab, but adab means that practices must be internalized, that must become part of your malaka, and that these habits must be in such a way that it reaches the asma, the highest goals, that tafakkur and tafaqquh is central. And when your practice becomes better, the irfan, the light will automatically come into your body. Adab means that you must now be very self-conscious when you do the practice. So you can't just do salah and wudu and those things automatically on autopilot. You must do it with a certain level of conscientiousness. And that is purely because we don't want to take the knowledge of the West as part of our Turath. We think that our Turath only goes back to Ghazali and to all the people that were Muslim. That's not true. Ghazali and other people thought that the Greeks and the Indians and everybody were part of their Turath, and therefore they included it. Now, just because you did not produce that knowledge, you now think that knowledge is a knowledge of enemies. But Mullah Sadra did not think that Greek knowledge is a knowledge of enemies. Ghazali didn't think so. Modern science, psychology, questions of anthropology, sociology, understanding the world, how the world operates, that's separate from the knowledge of philosophy and the question of science. So ulama are not part of that game. في الشرق والغرب حتى العلماء في الغرب يتقوقعون.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. Today we are interviewing Professor Ibrahim Musa, who is originally from South Africa. He gained his PhD from the University of Cape Town. He is specialized in Islamic and Arabic studies from Dar al-Ulum in India. He taught in Duke and Stanford University during his academic career. He is now a professor in Islamic thought and Muslim societies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. One of his famous books is Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. He also published Islam in the Modern World and Muslim Family Law in Sub-Saharan Africa. So first of all, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for being with us, Professor.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you so much, Sheikh Hadi, for having me on your program. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So in the beginning, you are a manifestation of an Islamic scholar who traveled all around from India to South Africa to Europe, and now in the United States. You have a wide intellectual and a spiritual journey. So before asking any intellectual question, we'd like to know more about yourself, about your love and dedication to the Islamic heritage and Islamic studies, and then later on, especially Ghazali and the centrality of the personality and thoughts of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And so tell us a summary about yourself, about the beauties of the tradition that you are studying and dedicating your life with.
Thank you so much. This is a great opportunity. I was born and raised in South Africa. My great-grandfather came to South Africa from India almost more than 100 years ago. And my mother was born in India. My father was born in South Africa. I was born in a very humble family of merchants. My great-grandfather started off as a fruit seller, and he was not very educated. And slowly the family went into kind of retail fruit and vegetable business and so on. And my great-grandfather, by the time he died, he became the kind of major merchant in the city of Cape Town, specializing in banana business and so on. And my family continued in the kind of a retail business. I went to school in South Africa under the apartheid regime. That is a regime that discriminated between people on the basis of color. Someone like myself was identified as Indian/colored, so we had to live in separate neighborhoods. Our family were uprooted from one part of the world and then replaced and moved into another part of South Africa. And so this was a kind of a continuation of apartheid dislodging ourselves. I was steady in my school studies, but I also had to work in the family business on weekends and on holidays and so on. And it happened that it is in my 11th year at school, one more year than I finished in high school. I always had the fascination of becoming a electronic engineer. So I like to play around with radios and fix radios and do things and so on. But one day in class, a student came in with a pamphlet, and this student was a non-Muslim, a Christian student. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He belonged to Jehovah's Witness. He had a pamphlet, and he said, well, Islam is a false religion. Muhammad got Islam from Christians, and Islam is not a true religion. And I said, why are you saying so? And he showed me this pamphlet. I took the pamphlet home. I studied it. I started thinking logically. The little bit I knew in the Sunday school where we were studying how to read the Tilawat al-Quran and literary history. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ did travel to Syria with his uncle Abu Talib, that I remembered. And yes, he did meet a rahib, he did meet a monk. Now, what is it possible that he could have learned? The monk could have taught him a lot of things. My logical mind says, I'm really scared as I'm thinking through these issues. I go to the library, I pick up books by people like William Muir, Muhammad and the Life of Islam, and I'm reading, and the way they write is that Islam, they don't say that, they don't fully believe that the revelation of Islam came to Muhammad. They would say Muhammad claims, Muhammad believes, is not a true faith in their view. So the way they write about Islam is also with a needle of doubt in it. Okay. And now I'm totally afraid. I don't know who to turn to ask questions. I can't ask my Sunday school teacher, my daily teacher who teaches me Islam, because he might not fully. There's no one in the family I can talk about. I do my prayers. I go to the mosque, and I'm partly crying, and I'm trying to read the Quran, and I'm reading in the Quran. It says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. And then I say, okay, is Allah the light? Is Allah, so how is Allah the light? So I'm having all this kind of doubts. Obviously, later in life, I believe I also see that my namesake, Nabi Ibrahim, had similar kinds of questions, who made the sun, who made the moon, who made the stars. But my question was limited to what I was reading in the Quran. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, so is Allah light? And I'm completely confused. The answer to, at least what was happening in the mosque there was a group of people called Jamaat Tabligh, the Tablighi Jamaat, an Indian group that comes and do da'wah to fellow Muslims. They were having their study circles, their halaqah at the mosque. So one day I joined them. And when I joined them, they were talking about mostly fada'il. They're not giving any kind of intellectual question, but they believe in that you must go to fellow Muslims, you must do da'wah, and must tell people, educate people about the virtues of Islam, how to become a good Muslim, to pray 5 times a day, to do the good things, and so on and so forth. So I got a little bit of emotional peace with this group, but the intellectual questions were still knocking in my mind. And I was thinking that, if I'm going to go forward in life, I need to know what is this thing called Islam. I'm reading 1 or 2 books, but these books are not giving me the answers. I need to know what Islam really is. I need to know what it is truly. And so I went to ask around and so on, and I met a few other friends in the Jamaat Tabligh who were also deciding that they want to go and study Islam. And they said, where are you going to study? And they said, we could study Islam in India. We go to traditional madrasas. That is what the Tabligh Jamaat connected us to. Some of my family members were found this as a very strange development within me. I'm the eldest son of my father. We are 6 children, and I want to go and do the study of Deen. They were not very familiar about what it is, because the only thing they think about is that once I graduate, I'm going to become an imam of a mosque. And they didn't see that as a very kind of, a profession that will maintain me in any kind of respectable way. So I had to persuade members of my family that this is a good thing that I'm going to do. And some members of the family said, why don't you go to the University of Durban, Westville, where there's a department of Islamic studies? And I said, why should I go to a university to study Islam? I want to study Islam at the feet of authentic teachers. Okay. I had no idea what this was, who those authentic teachers were. In the Jamaat Tabligh, I'm seeing people wearing long beards, they're wearing turbans, they wearing these kind of clothes. They give me some idea that these people are following the true sunnah in the proper way, in a very elementary way, in a very basic way. I was buying into that. And so finally, I was off to India. And I was first in Tabligh Jamaah, and then I went to a small madrasa because I didn't know any Arabic. I didn't know any Urdu, which is the language of instruction. So I had to go and learn these very basic tools to study. And 1 year in the region of Gujarat that I studied, I realized if I'm in India, I must go and study at the Harvard of all the madrasas, which is Darul Ulum Deoband. So off I went to Darul Ulum Deoband, which is 100 miles away from Delhi, and I continued my studies there at Darul Ulum Deoband. And at Deoband, of course, now my horizons are broadening. I'm no longer connected to and understand this question of wearing a beard and wearing particular kinds of clothing as essential, although the environment there very much insists on these things. But in my own mind, I was beginning to grapple that Islamic thought is more than what they are trying to teach me here. I started beginning to read the works of Abul Ala Maududi, political Islam. I'm reading those things. That's making me think about the world in a slightly different way. And obviously, this is now 1976, 77, 78. And then I realized that Deoband is also very narrow for me in terms of their outlook and the world that I will come to serve in South Africa. I was very much, sure that the way Deoband is teaching me Islam, South Africa has a big problem. That is the question of racism and the question of apartheid, which is the political system, and what is Muslims' answer in South Africa to that big problem that is a moral and ethical political problem in South Africa. And so I'm looking around for institutions in the Middle East where I could possibly study, but I don't find any kind of satisfactory outlet. Then I decided if I'm going to be in India, I'm going to go to Darul Ulum Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, where they teach very good Arabic, and it's slightly more flexible and more relaxed than Deoband. Deoband was very hardcore in its kind of doctrines and so on. And then obviously 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran happens. And we're all excited because I'm now very much on the path of kind of Islam changing the world. How does Islam change the world, right? And so I'm on that path. And I'm at Darul Ulum Nadwatul Ulama. I study the curriculum. I graduate from there. Obviously, people in Darul Ulum Nadwatul Ulama are not very enthusiastic about the Iranian Revolution. They see it as a Shiite revolution. There's all kinds of sectarianism coming in and so on and so forth. But I try to stay above the kind of sectarian issues, which is very difficult. But nevertheless, I kept an open mind. I see all different, from those days already, I was at a very young age, I understood that Muslims come in different shades and shapes and understandings and theological convictions. And yes, I have my own convictions, but I'm not in a position to judge others. And I've been striving most of my life to make different kinds of Muslims speak to each other. So that was the kind of the first phase of my life in India and graduating.
Great and very interesting introduction, and I don't know how to proceed. So later on,
there's a second phase. There's a second phase to that. While I was in Lucknow in Nadwa, there was a conference of Al-Mu'tamar Al-Alami Lil-Adab Al-Arabi, and great conference. My great teacher there was Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali Al-Nadwi. Abul Hassan al-Nadwi is very well renowned in the Arab world at that time. So he organized this conference. Many delegates from the Middle East came for this international conference on Arabic literature. One man from Egypt, I was also in the reception committee, so I had to go to the airport to go and receive this one guest. His name was Muhammad Fatih Uthman. And Muhammad Fatih Uthman was a big man, Egyptian, and started talking to him. I realized that he also speaks English. He is a PhD from Princeton University. He had co-edited the Ikhwan al-Muslimin's newspaper, Ad-Da'wa, with Sayyid Qutb. So he was quite a big name. I only heard of Sayyid Qutb. Now I met somebody who was working with Sayyid Qutb. And Fatih Usman, was very open. We could have lots of interaction and conversations with him. The first question I asked, what do you think of the Iranian Revolution? And he said, well, you know, it's a revolution. It's an important step in the Muslim world. We have to give it the time, opportunity to do it. So he was one of the first people that was kind of, you know, open to the idea that we have to listen because all the other voices I'm getting. But then the other thing that Fatih Uthman did, is that he gave an important speech there, a speech that, you know, completely shook the whole conference about how open we should be, how they as Egyptians, he as an Egyptian, and people in the Middle East look to India as a source of intellectual nourishment and intellectual spirituality, but also Shah Waliullah, Dehlavi, Mujaddid Al-Fithani, you know, all those other figures and the work that they've done. So, you know, he was very powerful. And I introduced Dr. Fatih Usman to all my friends, and we had late night meetings and so on. So Fatih Usman left, and I was now graduating, and I started writing letters to Harvard University and to Edinburgh University. I want to do graduate studies. I also write to Dr. Fatih Usman a letter to advise me, should I go to any of these Western universities, or should I go to Al-Azhar to continue my graduate studies? Dr. Fatih Usman does not reply to my letter. And I then got some money from my family, and I decided I'm going to go to Cairo, because all the letters and the kind of, you know, responses I'm getting from Edinburgh or from Harvard gives me lots of forms and cost a lot of money, and I have no idea how I'm going to pay for these expenses. So I said, let me try Al-Azhar. I bought my ticket to go to Cairo. And a week before I'm leaving, someone comes and says, I got a message for you from Dr. Muhammad Fatih Usman. I said, what? He says he's opened up, he's now an editor of a magazine in London called Arabia, the Islamic World Review, and he's inviting you to join the team as a writer, as a journalist. I changed my plans right there, because this was a great opportunity to go to London and to work with Fatih Usman and to learn from him. And I was always interested in writing, you know, in English and so on. So off I went into London. I worked for Arabia magazine. I went to journalism school at the City University, and now I'm getting into Middle East journalism. I work for Middle East Economic Digest magazine. I left Arabia magazine. Now I'm getting into business and finance, and I'm into the world of journalism. And then in 1984, I returned back to South Africa. There was some personal issues that happened. I returned back to South Africa. And before I left London to go to South Africa, I wrote to one of the important morning newspapers and asking them if they would have an opening for me to as a writer, as a journalist. And when I interviewed there, they said, when can you join? So then I've been away for too long. And my mother said, my son, you must come home. You've been away for a long time. So I then decided to stay in South Africa and continue my work there, first as a journalist. And then in 1987, I decided I had enough of journalism. I'm going to go to graduate school now, University of Cape Town, did a master's in religious studies. And then I got a job there as a junior lecturer and continued with my PhD there. So that's where I got there. In the meanwhile, while I was in South Africa after studying abroad, coming back to South Africa, in 84, there was a major development in the politics of South Africa. And that is the white South African government decided they're going to create 3 houses of parliament, one for whites, one for Indians, one for coloreds. But the majority black community is not accommodated in this new political framework. Plus, it is also separated. And we were all opposed to separation. We are one country, must have one democracy, and so on. So slowly and gradually, I am now called and invited by various Islamic groups to give my views and speak on public platforms. Or what does Islam say about justice and political transformation and injustice and so on. So I get drawn into a group called the Muslim Youth Movement. And when I resigned from my job as a journalist, I then become the national director of the Muslim Youth Movement of South Africa. And I'm also pursuing my graduate studies at the University of Cape Town in master's degree. So I'm now organizing young Muslims in South Africa into the questions of Islamic thought and doing a lot of teaching and education and guidance. And now going to university, my madrasa learning is now being exposed to contemporary discussions in sociology, philosophy, science, and those kinds of questions. Questions I always wanted to pursue and explore, but while I was a journalist or when I was an activist, I could only spend a minimal amount of time with. But now I could spend more time in thinking through these issues. I started also traveling around to Iran and to Malaysia and other places where I'm now making contact with the global Islamic community and beginning to understand a whole range of issues in context. So my life then turns into a life of scholarship together with the questions of the community. In other words, what Gramsci would call, I hope and I still believe that I'm an organic intellectual, that I'm an intellectual who sits in the university, but I would like to believe my feet are on the ground where the communities are. And I do believe that there must be a strong interaction between a scholar and the community that we are servicing.
Great and interesting. العلم والعمل. العلم يهتف بالعمل فإن أجابه وإلا ارتحل. And now, Professor, would like to delve more in your thoughts and ideas and the conclusions that you reached given your academic involvement and studies, and we'll reach eventually to Ghazali and the centrality of him. But before that, you talked about a very important idea, which is the philosophy of debate, the philosophy of حوار. And maybe from here we can enter to الغزالي, which is very important now, which is one of my main goals in this channel, is to do interviews and talks with many different scholars and professors in Islamic studies from different angles, different views, different perspectives, the people who spend years and years in studying this heritage and knowing the beauties of it. So why do you think it's such important, and what's the main obstacles that we're living until now? So for example, you're mentioning India and the الحواجز اللغوية والعرقية والإثنية والاجتماعية are very solid until now. So we're living in 2023, but these obstacles and barriers, I mean, are very strong and solid between the مذاهب, the fiqhi مذاهب, the kalami مذاهب, our stereotyping about others, black and white, and all different obstacles that keep people away from each other. I think you have a philosophy in this regard, and also when you knew Al-Ghazali and his tolerance, his rahmah, his perspectives in different books, especially in Fayصل التفرقة. I think you have something to say here in this context.
Yes. Well, this is important. Let me tell you, how do I get to Ghazali? So one of the people, so this part I didn't tell you. When I finished with the madrasas, I said, the madrasa has taught me a lot of things. I know a lot of things about Islam, but I don't know what is the big picture. I don't know what is the big picture. I know a lot of fiqh, I know a lot of ilm kalam, I know a lot of history. How does all this fit together? So therefore I went into journalism, completely turning my back on the Islamic thought that I had, right? What brings me back to the Turath and my studies is the struggle in South Africa, right? The political challenge that I have, right? The political struggle that I'm having. So one of the interesting things that happens to me, I read a book by a man called Fazlur Rahman. I read a book called Islam. And when I read this book changes my life. I said, this guy knows everything I know and more than me, and he can put this whole thing together in a beautiful story. It makes sense how history works, because he's telling us about Islamic history. Because the way I studied Islam at the madrasa, at the equivalent of the Hausa, is in a very dogmatic way. Now I'm studying Islam historically through Fazlur Rahman. So Fazlur Rahman, I owed a lot to him for opening my eyes. I started reading everything he started writing. his major themes of the Quran, Islam and modernity. I introduced some of his writings into the Muslim youth movement that I was leading and as a national director, as part of the curriculum, opening up conversations. So now that when I get to university, I must do a PhD topic. My first sense was, I must write about Fazlur Rahman, do more work on his thought. Fazlur Rahman dies in 1988. So one of the people whose work I'm also excited by, for some people he's very controversial. For me, he opens up a lot of conversations, is Muhammad Arkoon. Many people think of Muhammad Arkoon as in very bad ways. I treat, as you know, every Muslim who says he's a Muslim with respect. If we have difference of ideas, we will argue with ideas, but I do not do any kind of cursing or lan or anything. I would say Muhammad Arkoon, rahimahullah, right? And so Arkoon. So I keep on picking up the phone and I talk to Arkoon, discuss some ideas and so on. So I told him, I'm stuck with the PhD dissertation topic. I'm stuck between, now, I was also doing, at the one mosque, I was doing Jummah khutbahs. So Jummah khutbah, as you know, you require a topic to discuss. And the Imam of that mosque had left the country. He went abroad. He went into political exile. So I inherited his library in this office. And there was Ihya. So when I must prepare Jummah khutbah, I'm taking out Ihya and I'm starting to read. And I'm getting inspiration. I do remember that when I was a 17-year-old student in India, just new in India, the first book I bought was a translation, a section of Ihya with the red cover. But I started reading that book in English and I couldn't make much sense of it. So it always stayed on my bookshelves in India. And at some point I lost it. I couldn't find it. I must have given it to somebody. But many decades later, as now the Friday Khatib at the mosque, the Fridays giving the sermon, I'm studying Ghazali. And I'm now beginning to see, oh my gosh, this guy's got a lot of inspiring things to say. And I'm also reading Al-Mustasfa, his book on Usul al-Fiqh. And that also inspires me. So now I speak to Arkoon and I said, I'm torn between two ideas. Do I do a PhD on Fazlur Rahman or a Ghazali? So Arkoon, in his very French English, says, study Ghazali, he is richer, he is richer. Ghazali is rich. So I said, okay, thank you, you solved my dilemma. Off I went and I began to study Ghazali's usul and the question of language and kalam in Ghazali through the study of Al-Mustasfa. So Ghazali became a conversation partner long time already, because as a child I always heard about Ghazali, but I had not read a word of Ghazali. I had no idea what Ghazali was. And even throughout my student years in a madrasa, I didn't read a line of Ghazali, right? So this is my post-madrasa life that I'm now discovering Ghazali and also studying, modern thought that I'm now engaged with Ghazali. Now Ghazali, as you understand, as I've studied Ghazali throughout my life, I realize Ghazali is a very complex figure. Ghazali is not a straightforward figure. But what I like about Ghazali is like me and you as scholars. He's got anxieties. He has some strong views of what he thinks is the truth. He's also caught up in a political struggle in 11th century, early 12th century, Khurasan and in the Seljuk Empire. On the one hand, the Seljuks are challenged by the Ismaili Dawah, and he is defending the Sunni Abbasi creed under the Seljuks. He has Nizam al-Mulk, who's very much interested in Tasawwuf, but Nizam al-Mulk is also Shafi'i, and he establishes these important Nizamiya madrasas in which Ghazali himself studied, and afterwards Nizam al-Mulk appointed Ghazali as the professor of Shafi law at the Baghdad Nizamiya. Ghazali studies there, teaches there, for 4 years. 2 years are very productive years. He decides, but before that, before Ghazali becomes the professor of Shafi law at the Nizamiya in Baghdad, Ghazali had already studied and spent 4 to 5 years with Nizamul Mulk's retinue, his group of people that Nizamul Mulk had many, many experts as part of his team of scholars. So when Ghazali comes to Baghdad, the first 2 years are very productive because he's reading philosophy, he's writing books on philosophy, he first writes a collection of ideas of the views of philosophers, the maqasidul falasifa, the goals or purposes of the philosophers. Then he realizes in his mind that the philosophers, the Muslim philosophers, especially Ibn Sina, had crossed the line on some theological issues. So he then writes, Tahafutul Falasifa. But I think Ghazali also in that period, the next 2 years are the years that he is now seriously ill. He's psychologically ill, he says. He says he cannot move his tongue and he cannot really speak the way that he wants to speak. He's heavy-hearted. There's a certain kind of depression. It's also the same time that Nizam al-Mulk is assassinated. And it's also in that period that Ghazali writes Fadaih al-Batiniyya, the obscenities of the esoterists, which is a very strong, hard-hitting attack on the Ismailis and especially their doctrine that you must have an Imam al-Mutlaq, right? An Imam that knows absolutely. And Ghazali also has anti-Shia reflexes from time to time, right? Even though many Shia love him afterwards, but he is sometimes very critical of the Shia schools and so on and so forth from time to time, especially on the question of Imama that he is critical of. It comes from. Anyway, so Ghazali is that figure who is himself open to a whole range of political influences. Then obviously, as you know, after the 4th year, he decides he's going to leave and he goes on these long journeys and travels to places like Jerusalem and Syria and Damascus, where he's now meditating and reflecting on a whole range of issues. So Ghazali's life is not a fixed life. It's a life of intellectual struggle and intellectual agonizing and intellectual suffering. And he tries to work himself out of that. He tries to work. So we need to understand Ghazali not as someone, now that we have all his books, he looks like a very polished figure. Fantastically polished. What a brilliant guy. But we don't look into Ghazali's emotional and spiritual life, his ups and downs. And if you don't understand Ghazali through his ups and downs and his complex spiritual life, you don't get Ghazali. You don't understand Ghazali. And you can see that in his life. So for instance, when he writes Faisal al-Tafraqah, it's partly because he wants to bring people together, but he gets the very people that he is part of, the Ash'aris, because he has a different view on some aspects of Ash'arism. Say, for instance, the question of time, he has a different conception of time. Or he reads Baqillani and he likes some of Baqillani's views that differs from the strict Ash'ari perspective. He gets criticized from fellow Ash'arites. So with the result, he now realizes that these people are trying to put me under some kind of inquisition. I'm being subjected to some kind of mini heresy trials because now people are pointing fingers at him that your Aqidah is not right and you're not a good Ash'ari and so on and so forth. So therefore he writes, Faisal al-Tafraqah, creating several levels of interpretation that he calls 5 levels of wujud, 5 levels of existence, that if we can find an interpretation that meets any one of those levels of interpretation, it's within a legitimate understanding of Islam. Right? That is Ghazali's great contribution in this question of Faisal al-Tafraqah, to create people inside. But Ghazali still doesn't fully accept the fact that the philosophers could have a different view. their view that, for instance, that resurrection, hashr, would be spiritual and not physical, for him is subject to heresy.
The problem of المعاد الروحاني.
المعاد الروحاني, exactly. Second question is this question of whether God preoccupies himself with the particulars or with only the universals, right?
علم الله بالجزئيات.
Exactly, and exactly. And the third thing is the whole question of قدم العالم, right? Whether the world is eternal. The philosophers believe, in their understanding, in their ontology, in their فلسفة الوجود, that whatever comes out of al-awwal, out of the first, also has a certain element of eternity in it. It could be that the aspect of zaman, al-alam hadithun, بالذات قديم بالزمان, right? The element of time that creates the world into a certain state of what we would call eternity and so on. So Ghazali doesn't see that they could have a point of view. He thinks because they do not meet Ash'ari criterion, therefore they are out of the fold of Islam, right? They're out of the fold of Islam, except for the fact, if you read carefully, and he does do takfir of them, but if you read carefully the last page of Tahafutul Falasifa, when he asks the question, but you are saying that these people have committed kufr, does it mean they are mubahud dam? What does Ghazali do? He says, well, this is not the time to ask that question. What I'm saying, they are either mubtadi'ah in aqidah, or they are, maybe on the question of kufr. Now, one of the things that people don't understand, that Ghazali thinks about the word takfir, التكفير للتغليظ. التكفير, you use the term takfir in order to show I strongly disagree with you. But it doesn't necessarily mean إخراج من الدين. You see what I'm saying? Most people misunderstand.
ليس كفر فقهي يعني
Pardon me?
I mean كفر معرفي وليس كفر فقهي.
كفر معرفي, correct. And the other thing is that but when he's asked the question, are you saying we should kill people like Ibn Sina and his followers? He says, no, I don't want to go there. I'm not going to go there. He didn't want to go there. So it does seem to me that Ghazali uses the word takfir to show strong disagreement, but not necessarily meaning ikhraj min al-millah. Okay? So it doesn't mean that you have to exclude them from the community of Muslims. But I still think that Ghazali could have done better, given his vision, his understanding. Now, I don't think, as some people like Muhammad Abid al-Jabri or Hassan Hanafi, my late friend, and so on, they say that, it's Ghazali because of Ghazali's attack on philosophy died in the Muslim. I don't believe that. That is very simplistic understanding, and that is what I call scapegoat historiography. التاريخانية الكبش الفداء. التاريخانية عن طريق كبش الفداء. So they make Ghazali the scapegoat. Okay, that doesn't make any sense, because there was a lot of philosophy after Ghazali, lots of philosophy and so on. So some people, some Ash'aris, some Shafi'is, and some Shafi'is who don't like philosophy, who don't like kalam, they use Ghazali to say, see, Ghazali criticized philosophy. But Ghazali himself internalized a lot of philosophy. In the introduction to his book, Al-Mustasfa, he writes a whole muqaddimah, fil mantiq. And he says that this is very important for you to study. It's a beautiful introduction. Very, very, much simpler and much better than Qistas al-Mustaqim that Ghazali wrote, and some of his other works in the muqaddimah. And what does he say? He says, if you are interested in usul al-fiqh, then you should go to chapter 1. And then you can skip this muqaddimah. But then he says something that most Shafi'is and most Asharis never forgave him for. He says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَوْعِبْ بِهَذِهِ الْمُقَدِّمَةِ فَلَا ثِقَةَ فِي عِلْمِهِ أَصْلًا. That if you don't understand these questions of logic and propositions of language, then your knowledge cannot be trusted. Right? Ibn Salah was scandalized by that. How can Ghazali say something like that? But Ghazali said it. So Ghazali, as you also know, he said, that خير العلوم مزدوج العقل والنقل, the very healthy balance between aql and naql. So Ghazali is very important because he also understands the question of science and the material world well. Now, many people criticize Ghazali, that Ghazali, when it comes to question of causation, al-sababiyya, that Ghazali doesn't believe that fire burns cotton. No, people misunderstand. If you tell Ghazali, put your finger in this fire, he will say, you think I'm going to put my finger in there? What Ghazali is saying, that in terms of what we call teleological causation, the kind of the cause of causes is caused by God. So he wants to keep that consciousness alive, that when I pick up this pencil, when I pick up this pen, this mechanical pencil, when I pick it up, my ikhtiyar is involved, but at the same time, God has endowed me with power to make my will possible. So at every moment, that is the Ash'ari understanding, right, of kasb, that you're acquiring this power, but it keeps this power alive. It is not that I have potential in my hands, and then I use my potential and my will, and I pick up the pen. The Ash'arites and people like Ghazali want to keep the consciousness alive, that in this very act of my will is also the will of God is right there. It's connected to it in this meta frame.
وما رميت ولكن الله رمى.
وما
رميت ولكن الله رمى، يعني إشارة إلى القدرة الإلهية المطلقة.
مطلقة exactly، إشارة إلهية قدرة مطلقة exactly. وما رميت إذ رميت ولكن الله رمى exactly. So it is that consciousness one to bring about. So Ghazali doesn't deny. For instance, Ghazali rebukes many theologians that say that when you have a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, khusuf al-khusuf, that is because God has given a command to, these objects that happens. Ghazali says these kind of theologians who talk like that, they misunderstand both the hadith and they don't understand how science works, and they are the enemies of Islam, because they put Islam into disrepute. So Ghazali also helps me, at least in my life. Ghazali made me understand this question, that one must have a proper understanding of Islam and to explain Islam out there. And of course, the biggest gift Ghazali gives us in إحياء علوم الدين is when Ghazali, I call it, Ghazali talks about, lawhul qalb. Lawhul qalb. That book is basically a book written on Ghazali's heart. I call that heart writing. Al-kitabatu min al-qalb or ala lawh al-qalb. In other words, every book, as you know, starts with, the adab of salah, the adab of this, the adab of zakat, of Sawm, and so on. And then the books on love and mahabba and ishq, and the books on how to interact with your family, and the book, every book in what's name is all got to do with adab. In other words, he wants to see the ethical and how the ethical imparts on the soul and how the ethical can transform the soul. So that's the great gift of Ghazali, is that he has made what his basic Islamic teachings has given it a kind of a higher value and interpretation of how that connects to your spirituality, your ruhaniyah. And that's the Ghazali's greatest gift, I think. So he's a man who is both intellectual but also spiritual. and it connects the heart to the mind, and the mind to the heart. And you cannot cut this off. It must go together. So knowledge is always affective. Knowledge makes us do things. We talk about ilm wal amal. Inna alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat, right? Amanu wa amilu salihat. And a lot of people say that inna alladhina amanu wa means a. Inna alladhina amanu a amilu salihat. That iman means you must act upon it. But what it really means that if we really truly understand, if we attain to faith, we have ilm. Ilm makes you do things. It makes you, gives you affect. Affect means it touches you emotionally. When it touches you emotionally, you need to do things. If I tell you, read a beautiful poem to you, and you started moving your head, or you started, jiving with the poem has touched you. But if I read you a poem that only reaches your mind in not an exciting way, you will not crack a smile, or you'll not become emotional about it, right? So every knowledge is affective. And so that is one of Ghazali's great gifts, that he combines the Islamic tradition through its standard teachings of, Quran, Sunnah, Ilm al-Kalam, Fiqh, Usul al-Fiqh, Adawatul Lugha, poetry, and so on, together with tasawwuf, right? And that tasawwuf is not something separate, but integral to Islam.
Professor, I have many interesting questions here, but first I'll mention this small comment before I go to the questions, which is that even if Ghazali in Tahafut al-Falasifa was criticizing philosophy, so in other words here he's reviving philosophy, because when this leads to other critiques and other writings and a great debate. So يحرك الساحة الفكرية في الفكر الفلسفي. This is one. Secondly, anyone that wants to critique philosophy, he must understand philosophy very well. So he should be a philosopher. And thirdly, when criticizing, any scholar criticizes certain theories of the philosophical thought. So he has his own philosophy also, which he's presenting. He's not criticizing the whole topic of using philosophy in understanding religion. So this is a point that can be mentioned here.
Yes, absolutely. So Ghazali is not rejecting philosophy. He's rejecting only some parts and some theories. But unfortunately, a lot of people are arguing and making claims that Ghazali, is anti-philosophy. That's not true. Ghazali is very much into philosophy. In fact, his student Ibn Arabi al-Maliki said, that our master al-Ghazali ابتلع الفلسفة حاول أن يتقيأ فلم يستطع. That he internalized so much philosophy, he tried to imit it, but he was unable to do so. So Ghazali thinks that philosophy is a very, very good thing, and irrespective of what people who are saying that Ghazali is anti-philosophy did not read a word of Ghazali.
Mm-hmm. Great. Professor, an important question that I'd like to impose here, and I'd like to hear about your presentation and analysis of the stages that Ghazali lived. So, as if we see that he's facing حالة من الشك إلى اليقين, حالة من الحيرة إلى المعرفة, and different stages that he lived. So in the beginning, he was busy too much with fiqh and kalam mainly, and due to social and political situations and context, he turned to studying philosophy. Then he wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, and in certain contexts, he wrote about Fayصل التفرقة بين الإسلام والزندقة, and there is a view of tolerance and religious pluralism and respecting all different sectors and views in Islam, and maybe we can understand it beyond Islam even. And then he spent years in khalwa and uzla and meditation and a certain Sufi and Irfani relation with God, which resulted in his Mawsu'a إحياء علوم الدين, which became one of the main Mawsu'as of Irfan and Sufism and Akhlaq in the Muslim world and in the Muslim history, where we see all different sectors are يحشون ويفرعون من الغزالي. All the different sectors, they believe that he's very central in presenting deep Islamic عرفاني ethics إن صح التعبير. So my question here, in analyzing the stages of Ghazali in creating this existential spiritual scholar, and the importance of these different stages التي صنعته وشكلته, where a person, if he feels and lives such stages, he will become such a scholar, which is very different than a person who just sits and thinks and creates ideas.
Yes. Well, Ghazali's own biography, his own life history is indicative of some of these stages. So definitely, there were definitely stages. We do see that at a very young age, he's exposed to some basic teaching of tasawwuf at a very young age by his teacher Ar-Radkani. Okay? But as you know, the family had a great difficulty, and his mother, the father died when they were young. So Muhammad and Ahmad were put into a madrasa where they were fed and they got basic elementary education, right? And Ghazali remembers that because he says, طلبنا العلم لغير الله فأبى أن يكون إلا لله. He doesn't say that himself, but Subki reports that. Subki reports it. Ghazali never wrote about that, but that's how Subki captures that in his biography, that Ghazali did say something like that. In other words, when Ghazali thought back on his life of his childhood, he realized that they went to the madrasa only to get a plate of food to survive. As you know, at a very young age, he goes to Jurjan, where he goes and learns, the Shafi madhab from a certain number of teachers in Jurjan, and he learns a lot of khilaf al-fiqh. When Ghazali comes back, obviously from there, he goes to Nishapur, and he's studying with Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramain. He's brilliant. Ghazali is among the top 5 students, there were many other students with him, Khawafi and others, but Ghazali was very smart. He knew his fiqh, he knew ilm al-kalam. But while he was still a student, he started composing and writing a small book that his teacher Juwayni said, was very angry with him and said, Allah sabarta hatta amut. Qataltani wa ana hay. That normally the adab was that you don't write a book while you're still under the tutelage of your teacher. But Ghazali already started writing the book. Those were his khilaf things that he studied in Jurjan. He kept serious notes of those and he kept them and so on. And his teacher said, you killed me while I'm still alive. So already Ghazali is an iconoclast. In other words, he breaks the model, he breaks the mold of things. Whether it was, Juwayni was just, upset with him, or some people say that Juwayni was also, silently admiring this young student and also how brilliant he was, and maybe a little bit jealous, which is human. That is all human, possible. So anyway, so that there. And when he finishes in Nishapur, he then goes, he is spotted by Nizam al-Mulk, so he joins Nizam al-Mulk's retinue for at least 7 to 8 years. There he is, because Nizam al-Mulk kept with him, people that are Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, different schools of thought, philosophers and so on. So Ghazali is now learning from very big names there, and he's picking up a lot of stuff. So that's the one phase. So that phase, his early phase, and when you see his writings of that early phase, he's very critical about Abu Hanifa. He said Abu Hanifa is not really a serious scholar. His students, Muhammad al-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf were far better than him, and he points out some errors of Abu Hanifa in one of his early books of usul, and obviously. So then it's a phase that he has when he now becomes a professor at Nizamiya. 2 good years and 2 very bad years for him. He leaves and goes into Khalwa. Now, what we don't know, until today, we don't know who's Ghazali Sheikh. Whether Ghazali does he administer himself his own spiritual itinerary, whether he developed it himself, or whether he got it from other people without mentioning it. Because in these travels, he met many sulaha and salihun, and he met many people, people of marifa, people of great spiritual insight, where he traveled and so on and so forth. So we don't know exactly which kind of spiritual recipe he adopted. We also don't know whether Ghazali himself had some kind of spiritual experience. The only indication we have is an al-munqidh min al-dalal. When he says, I studied the juris and I was not satisfied. I studied the ilm al-kalam, I was not satisfied. I studied the philosophers, I was not satisfied. The only people that really gave me satisfaction was with the people of tasawwuf and the ahlul qalb and the ahlul marifa. Because how does he put it? Because لنور ألقى الله في قلبي, because of a light that Allah has placed in my heart. So for him, that light makes all the difference. In other words, that light puts what we call his discursive knowledge. So kalam, ilmul kalam, and all those kind of stuff is discursive knowledge. And what he does in إحياء علوم الدين is to bring what we call discursive knowledge into conversation with ethical knowledge of the heart, knowledge of the soul. So he tries everything to bring things to what the famous hadith is, إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. So the Prophet ﷺ says that I was dispatched to the world to complete the project of akhlaq. And Ghazali saw that all of this Islamic learning must result in akhlaq. If it doesn't result in akhlaq, then it is of no good. لا جدوى ولا فائدة فيه. Okay? So for Ghazali, this was very critical. This question of to connect Islamic practices to its spiritual outcomes. So it is not, Ghazali doesn't tell you about how many dreams he had and how many times he saw the Prophet. It's not this heavy esoteric stuff. It's also not Ibn Arabi, when Ibn Arabi goes on big flights of insight and writing and reflection and pushing the boundaries. Ghazali very much stays within the boundaries. Sometimes when he talks in Ihya al-Din and he begins to push the boundaries and he says, but this book is about ilm al-muamala, and I'm now beginning to talk about ilm al-mukashafa, and I've been told and warned already that ifsha'u sirr rububiyyati kufrun, that to expose the mysteries of the divine can result in kufr. Then he stops himself. He doesn't write further. But he does let you know that there are some places you can go and get more. But it seems that Ghazali wrote Ihya Ulumuddin in such a way for a wider audience, but from which both Khawas and Awam, both specialists who can see the direction, can jump into, and the Awam, the lay people, can also get a lot of benefit. So because packed into the general audience are indicators that there are some new ladders that you can climb. There are many places that there's a sullam put there, but you need to discover the sullam. You need to discover the ladder.
Professor, this passage that you mean maybe in المنقذ من الضلال, where he says وانكشفت لي في أثناء هذه الخلوات أمور لا يمكن إحصاؤها واستقصاؤها، والقدر الذي أذكره لينتفع به أني علمت يقينا أن الصوفية هم السالكون لطريق الله تعالى خاصة، وأن سيرتهم أحسن السير وطريقهم أصوب الطرق وأخلاقهم أزكى الأخلاق.
أزكى الأخلاق. نعم. And another place in what's name, that's beautiful, and that's exactly what he says. And another place he says, نور قذفه الله وألقى الله في قلبي, in the إحياء. And that is because when you have that light, then all the different pieces come together. And of course, Ghazali spent a lot of time in Mishkatul Anwar, one of his later writings, Mishkatul Anwar, which is all about these questions about how, so it is kind of, how do we know, and how do we know? By knowing, we come closer to God, right? We come closer to Allah. So this question of light, and it's a complete meditation on these verses that I, as a child, as a young person, these verses did not make much sense to me. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. But now that I read Ghazali, I begin to understand the levels of meaning that Ghazali understands through these verses, and it's very, very beautiful. So, rahimahullah, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, because he did really a great service to Islam.
Even as مقصد الأسنى في شرح أسماء الله الحسنى, where it's a great book in
yes.
the Asma.
Exactly. These are all meditations on the Asma Allah al-Husna, of course. And Arba'in fi Usul al-Din also, where he connects Usul al-Din to questions of Sifat. Right? The Usul al-Din are connected to big values and attributes of God. So Ghazali is very much thinking of how to bring knowledge of Deen to the question of and questions of faith, to keep the faith and what together. One of the challenges that Ghazali leaves us, and this is a difficult issue because I love Ghazali, but I think Ghazali sometimes framed knowledge too narrowly as knowledge that only leads to najat and knowledge of salvation. In other words, Ghazali was so preoccupied with his soul that he forgot there is a world. Now he does say from time to time in the Ihya Ulumuddin, well, in the place where there is no doctors, then it is, fard, that you must, fard kifaya, that somebody must go and study medicine. And sometimes he says, yes, that they are, but this division between ulum al-dunya and ulum al-akhirah has many of the ulama, unfortunately, did not think through those issues. Because in Ghazali's world and in the Seljuk Empire, the dunya was taken care of. There were great scholars and engineers and great politicians that were running the society. Everything was functioning. Ghazali himself says, I was very, very thankful to the fact that I could go for the 7 years away and travel away from home. And the people of Khurasan took care of my family. Someone took care of his family. So there was a social system that someone like him could go and do khalwa and talab al-ruhaniyah, and there are social resources that take care of his family, their material needs. See what I'm saying? So Ghazali didn't spend much time about how, but unfortunately, a lot of people in the houses, in the madrasas, and other places have internalized this idea of knowledge, that the real knowledge is only in ilm al-din. And this, what I think is a very, very, this very unhelpful distinction between al-ilm al-ali wal-ilm al-ali, instruments and high knowledge. How can you, so if you say nahu as ilm al-ali, or you say balagha is, min al-alat, when you're reading the verse of the Quran and you are understanding the balagha and the nahu, without the balagha and the nahu, you can't understand the beauty of the Quran. So the nahu and the balagha and is already in the Quran. So unfortunately, we have made, so maybe it is helpful that, yes, if you're a student, first study these ulum al-ali, Okay, these necessary ones. But we mustn't take that too seriously as a division, because language is an intricate part of ilm al-kalam, as is the tafsir, as of hadith, and so on and so forth. Language is not separate. Yes, when we are at a young age, we teach you these things, but philosophically, they are all combined. And maybe we, as scholars of Ghazali, must show in Ghazali's own work how these things are combined. If you read his Usul al-Fiqh, if you read his Muqaddimah to al-Mustasfa, you can see that language and logic is intimately tied, and is intimately tied to concepts and ideas and thought. They are not separated, okay? Because these various ideas are being taught, are then being used in Usul al-Fiqh proper, and so on. So I think this is very important to understand Ghazali as a complex scholar, and that we need to go beyond Ghazali, because in today's world, you can have all the ulum al-deen, but if your dunya is in a state of breakdown, you are not going to have the satisfaction to practice your deen. If there's poverty, if there's war, if there's destruction, if there's no hikmah, if people are fighting amongst each other, if everybody's not working to create a good life, things are going to fall apart. Ghazali was very lucky. He was at the time where things were stable around him.
Mm-hmm.
Politics were stable.
One question, Professor. So why he titled it by إحياء علوم الدين? So what's the political or the social or even the knowledgeable context that he lived in, that he believed that religion needs a revival? So what was dead there? The ethical and spiritual and the Sufi dimension of Islam was dead, and so he want to revive the hearts and spirits of people. So what about إحياء علوم الدين? And there are other people, they say that الإسلام لا يحتاج إلى إحياء بل يحتاج إلى maybe فهم. So what's the secret beyond إحياء?
أستخير تعالى ثالثا فيما انبعث عزمي من تحرير كتابة إحياء علوم الدين، وأنتدب لقد تعجبك رابعا أيها العادل والمتغالي. And he goes on and on and on, and then he says what has happened is that people are ignoring, he says, the fuqaha, and particularly he's hard on the fuqaha. He says that all they are interested in, they are not interested in facing and giving the knowledge to Allah, but they are all about the dunya. So the Ihya Ulum al-Din is a critique of the fuqaha who made fiqh into an ilm al-dunya. And therefore he does say in one place in Ihya Ulum al-Din that fiqh is an ilm al-dunyawi in the hands of many people. We're not entirely sure whether he really means it or whether he is doing this sarcastically, whether there's an element of tahakkum in it, whether he's,
the separation of fiqh from its overall ethical and spiritual and theological context.
Yes, exactly. And therefore he says, الفقه علم طريق الآخرة. الفقه وعلم طريق الآخرة. Fiqh is to understand the path to the hereafter, not to understand the various masail and so on and so forth, but really can you go, that can you understand the spiritual and ethical value of things? Because he says the only things that people are interested in is to give fatwa and to have power over hakuma. Hakuma is when you are dealing with questions of wealth of a people, of a family, and so on and so forth, then you are governing, you have a certain kind of, as a faqih, you are in control of that wealth, and then you say how it is, and you can also get some benefit out of that. So he's very, very critical of that. That's what he says in the opening lines of Ihya Ulumuddin. So basically, why is it ilm? So some of my friends say, today we need Ihya Ulumuddin. Dunya, we don't need Ihya Ulumuddin. In the Muslim world, that Muslims are fallen behind, we need Ihya Ulumuddin. Yes, we need that. But Ghazali wrote Ihya Ulumuddin because he thought that the people who are entrusted with the deen are using the deen as a way to acquire the dunya. So he's trying to remind them, to bring them back to the real purpose of deen, which is ilmu tariq al-akhirah. fiqh is ilm tariq al-akhirah, and he wants to open that door. And the other thing is, you will see that in nearby the Kitab al-Ilm, he says that I need to do several things. So he said one of the first things that we need to redefine what is ilm. We must redefine what is hikmah. Those are the very important things that he says that we need to redefine. So what this project is to redefine the manahij al-ma'rifah in Islam. The manhaj al-ma'rifah, and he develops, 4 different kinds of categories that he says that, and the other one is what is dhikr wa tadhkir. Must rethink those issues too, and so on and so forth. These are some of the elements. I'm just trying to find it in my book, but yeah. So the first thing is to rethink the question of 4 words that he says that we need to rethink: fiqh, ilm, tawheed, and tadhkir, and hikmah. 5 things. 5 things that he says. اعلم أن منشأ التباس العلوم المذمومة بالعلوم الشرعية تحريف الأسامي المحمودة وتبديلها ونقلها بالأغراض الفاسدة إلى معان غير ما أراد السلف الصالح والقرن الأول، وهي 5 ألفاظ: الفقه والعلم والتوحيد والتذكير والحكمة. فهذه أسامي محمودة، والمتصفون بها أرباب المناصب في الدين، ولكنها نقلت الآن إلى معان مذمومة، فصارت القلوب تنفر عن مذمة من يتصف بمعانيها لشيوع إطلاق هذه الأسامي عليه. So he's basically saying that these are the 5 terms: fiqh, ilm, tawheed, tadhkir, and hikmah. That is the question of Islamic, what we call law, fiqh, knowledge. Tawheed, I'm also translating for your audience, that is monotheism. And tadhkir, that is remembrance of God. And hikmah, and wisdom. And he says that they have now been discussed and developed in such a way that the hearts are repelled from them. Instead of these 5 terms must draw the hearts to it. Therefore, these 5 words have to be redefined to the way it was in the very beginning of Islam, not the way that these things have the way these words have become. Because the way these words have become is that the way these words have become have been destructive and do not deliver the goods, do not deliver the values that Islam anticipates. So I think this is very, very insightful. Not enough attention has been paid. Not enough attention has been paid to this diagnosis of Ghazali of how Ilm al-Din became Ilm al-Dunya in his time. So he's trying to bring it back to Ihya, to Ilm al-Din. But that requires going back to these fundamental categories.
Professor, towards the end of his life, so he was well known and respected as a Hujjat al-Islam and al-Imam and al-Mujaddid and al-Allama, or that happened after his death, especially when he wrote إحياء علوم الدين, and he was considered as a Sheikh, Sufi, or a very spiritual scholar, or no, this happened after.
So we don't know, to the best of my knowledge, wallahu alam, we don't know whether he was a Sufi Sheikh. What we do know is that when he finished travel, he went back to his home in Tus. He had a nice house. He had a very beautiful garden. And he tended his garden and had a few selected students who used to study with him. Okay? And at one stage when he was there, Fakhrul Mulk, who was Nizam al-Mulk's son, asked him to come and teach at the Nizamiya of Nishapur. And Ghazali is very reluctant because he had made a decision that he doesn't want to get involved with government and with people in politics again. But because Fakhrul Mulk is Nizam al-Mulk's son, he said that because Fakhrul Mulk told him that there's a lot of fitan, and we need someone like you to come put out the fires of the fitan. And then he writes about that in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. And then he says, this is the closest he comes. He says that some people, he did istikhara, and he asked other people to do istikhara, that is to make prayers and then to see if there's any good that will come out of this decision that he's going to take. So some people told him that this is also the time, the beginning of a new century, and that somebody will come and do tajdeed. And maybe this is the calling onto him from God, that he must now come out and do the work. That this writing books, staying at home, tending to your garden, teaching a few students, this is not. So I think this is not enough. You must now really come down into the field and deal with the trouble that is there in the society. But he was only there for 18 months, and the moment Fakhrul Mulk died, he went back home. He went back to Tus.
As if he was embarrassed or forced in a way or another to help them and be there.
So he you see, I think Ghazali's spiritual breakdown in Baghdad, in my view, is that I think he felt that he had put his knowledge to the service of politics, of which he's ashamed, and he's very embarrassed. That undid him, because I think he realized the sacrality of knowledge, and he asked himself, what am I doing here? Why am I putting my talents in the service of political authorities, which I'm not entirely sure if they are also all right? So I think that drove him crazy. That drove him, in other words, I mean crazy in the sense, made him very worried, made him do a lot of muhasaba, deep muhasaba that led to a certain kind of paralysis, deep paralysis, that he says, I can't move my tongue. And he says, people will think if I leave this teaching post, teaching is the highest service I can do. If I tell the people that I want to leave this, they will think that I am not right. I'm not fully healthy. Therefore, he said, therefore, I made the excuse that I want to go for Hajj. But he said, I made up my mind, I will never come back again here. So the excuse was to go for Hajj, put his brother Ahmed there in his place, and he never came back. So Ghazali, because he realized that people will not fully understand what he's trying to do. If he leads, look, ilm and teaching of ilm is one of the highest respectable things you can do. And here, Nizam al-Mulk was passed away already by that time. He was dead already. But here he has the highest, respect. He gets a very big salary. When he comes into Baghdad and he is honored to become the new professor, he's on a very fancy horse, very expensive brocaded clothing. He is wearing, very expensive clothes. He was very highly respected, and he attended the giving the oath of office to Al-Mustazhir. When Al-Mustazhir became Khalif, the very young Khalif, when he took the office of becoming the Khalif, Ghazali was there, giving him the oath of office. So he was widely respected in government circles. But he soon realized that this is not what I am all about. There's something missing here. I'm getting all this honor and respect, but there's a emptiness in my soul. That caused, some Iranian scholar wrote a book, Al-Firar min al-Madrasa. It's all about Ghazali. Ghazali then ran away from the madrasa. His name is Zarrin Kub, the Iranian scholar, Zarrin Kub. He wrote this book, Al-Firar min al-Madrasa, because Ghazali now tries to find his soul. And that he realized that the more I get involved in this political stuff, one, I'm not sure what this will result in. And secondly, he's also afraid of the assassin's dagger, that he could be next. Nizam al-Mulk was killed. He wrote a very strong, critical book against the Ismailis. He actually said that the Ismailis, their tawbah should not be accepted. They should be executed. He says, you can't believe them because they do taqiyya. Then he says, well, this is my ijtihad. Someone else can disagree with me. Ghazali says, he knows he's on a very tricky position because this is a political ijtihad that he's making. So he does say in Al-Mustafa, other people might disagree with me, but this is my ijtihad. So Ghazali is a complicated figure. If we want to end sectarianism between Sunni, Shia, Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, Salafi, Sufi, Ibadi, we should all be one. We should not do these languages of hatred and languages of what's it. Yes, have, wajadilhum billati ahsan. But one of the things you talked about, disagreement, one of the things that Ghazali in his later life, he became totally opposed to munadara, to debates. His early life,
المراء والجدال.
المراء والجدال. Yeah, he was totally against it. He says that what it doesn't result in ilm, it only develops ego positions. I'm right, you're wrong. And he said, you're not interested in the truth. So in his early life, he was very much interested in that. He made complete repentance, and he said that is totally unacceptable. And if we want to talk to each other as Muslims today, what do we learn from Ghazali? One of the things I find so important about Ghazali is that as a figure of the Turath, we mustn't only study Ghazali like we study a dead body. So in my book, Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, I criticize those scholars who study Ghazali and want to know, what did Ghazali say and what did Ghazali say? But they're not getting inspiration from Ghazali to do the work of Ghazali today. So I want to have a conversation with Ghazali. Yes, you took Sufa, but today we disagree with you on this, but we agree with you on that. That must be the conversation with Ghazali. Ghazali must inspire us. I always tell people in the Muslim world, you criticize the West and the West and the West so much. But do you know the amount of time the West takes and the resources the West puts in to study its own history? In every small university or big university or college in this country, you'll find a department of classics. They'll be studying the Roman classics, they'll be studying the Greek classics. And in universities like mine at Notre Dame, at Duke, at Stanford, there are 40 and 50 professors in one department studying just the early history of the West, writing ancient books, doing paleography, doing all kinds of research. In the Muslim world, we don't do any serious study at our university and college about the early history of Islam. I've seen philosophy professors in Damascus sitting 6-7 people in one office. There's not resources like that. When I was at the University of Cape Town, I had the size of that office for myself alone, right? So we do not value knowledge. We need to invest knowledge to understand our Turath and to study Buhayan Tawhidi, to study Ma'arri, to study all those people, the variety of peoples. Again, I mentioned 2 people that some people consider to be very dangerous. Zanadiq al-Islam, Thalath, I mentioned Tawhidi and Ma'arri already. But we need to study other scholars so we get the bigger picture. We need to look into the Ibadi tradition, which is a very, very complex and big tradition. The Imami tradition, the Ismaili tradition, the varieties of Ash'aris and the varieties of Maturidis and the Mu'tazila. We need to study these things. This is how you have Ihya Turath. Ihya Turath is not to do halal haram. Then you don't understand what is Turath. Then you are basically grade 1 madrasa. But if you want to do, as in Iran they talk Dars Kharij, and you want to do advanced scholarship, then every opinion counts and every opinion must be studied on its merits. So what I think we need to do with Ghazali and with any other scholar that you study You must be in a conversation. Look, today in the political science department at the University of Notre Dame, when they discuss any topic, they're either quoting Plato or Aristotle. They bring him into the conversation with Locke, into the conversation with a contemporary philosopher with Habermas. The conversation goes right from min al-bidaya ila al-nihaya. What we do, we want to quote verses of the Quran, one hadith there. We don't have fikr. We don't have thought. Thought that is systematic thought. Organized thought. One of the things that the work we need to do with Ghazali, I sent you an article of mine where I think about, how can Ghazali help us to think through questions of freedom of speech? So freedom of speech was not a value in his time. Freedom of speech is a value in our time. But Ghazali did realize that I need to create a conversation between different Muslims, rather than them talk to each other than pointing their knives against each other. So therefore he wrote Faisalul Tafraqah, Bain al-Islam. So yes, he has a hard boundary, right? But today in our world, we can say, no, we're not looking for Zandaqah, we're looking for conversation. We're looking for حوار between
So what is التفرقة بين الإسلام والزندقة? If I'd like to ask you more about this book, because I can see this book in many footnotes about the issue of religious pluralism from different scholars who are writing about this topic. So how can we find a certain theory of tolerance or pluralism or rahma manifested here in Faisal al-Tafriqa, and not only talking about the people of Islam, but rather wider and all the different people of religions or philosophies or societies or thinking. So can we grasp a certain idea from Ghazali and apply it wider?
Yes. So in order to, you see, Ghazali did the work in his time. Ghazali can't do the work for us in our time. If we're going to Ghazali to give us answers today, it's a big mistake. Ghazali does that.
We can build on him, build on what he worked.
We can build on him, or we can say he has opened the door for conversation. But the question of freedom was not an important question for Ghazali. The question of freedom for us, for you to have the freedom to say your opinion without being harmed, and for me to say my opinion without being harmed, that is the value for us. So then we can say, so what it requires? It requires building on Ghazali. But that requires a proper understanding of our conditions, but also it requires courage. What is the courage? The courage to say that this question of freedom does not only apply to those people of my Aqidah, but also the freedom for the people of the other Aqidah to be able to put their point of view, and I want to hear them and I want to discuss it with them. Right? So that's the big issue. Amongst the Firaq al-Islam, we have the doctrine of 73 sects and only one is Firqa Najiyah. And everyone thinks that they are the Firqa Najiyah. Right? So we're not going anywhere there, right? So what we really need to do is to develop a set of values, new values that we add. So toleration, when people say Ghazali taught toleration, that toleration of Ghazali is not the toleration we're looking for today. So Ghazali, for instance, would not possibly, because even in Faisal al-Tafriqa, he still does takfir of the philosophers. He excludes them, and he uses strong language.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody, so it is.
If we analyze deeply the ethical views of Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin, so it's a continuation of the Greek philosophy thoughts in ethics and in splitting the spirit into four powers, and in having the idea of i'tidal between akhlaq, between ifrat and tafrit. So it's a continuation of the Greek philosophical thought and ethics, isn't it?
In one sense it is, but in another sense, Ghazali has also moved away from that. So yes, you can see, for instance, there are elements of, say, Aristotle's. He was very much into Aristotle. He was a big Aristotelian. Although in Mishkat al-Anwar, there's a lot of Aflatun and Platonism in there, because it's all about the light and single light and so on. But come back. So there is an element of the kind of Aristotelian element of the question of the ethical. But what Ghazali does, through the help of the Quran and the Prophet of Islam, that he connects it to this question of the spiritual and the question of salvation. That's what Aristotle doesn't do. Aristotle doesn't take you to a point of salvation. Aristotle doesn't take you to the point of your soul. Aristotle does talk about the soul, but Aristotle is more interested in the balance of your soul. How do you keep things in balance? But Ghazali says, no, you want the light. You don't only want the soul, but you want the light in your soul. And the light in your soul comes through practice, through a certain malaka that you develop, right? You must develop this malaka, this habit within yourself. But this malaka is of such a nature that it's a light-giving malaka, not a knowledge-giving malaka, but it's ilm wal amal. Therefore, Mizan al-Amal is such an important. In fact, if you think about Mizan al-Amal of Ghazali, it is actually a distillation of the whole Ihya Ulumuddin. In many ways, the main themes are taken in Mizan. And especially the last section of the Mizan al-Amal is all about what is a madhab. And he's got very interesting ideas on the madhab there. Very interesting ideas. For instance, he says, let's think about the madhab. He says, the word madhab is a kalima mushtarak. It's lafz mushtarak. It is a homonym. It has different meanings. So he says, look, in the neighborhood where you are born, if you grew up amongst Karamis or Shafi'is or Imamis and so on, you will be internalizing the culture of that area. That becomes part of your madhab. Then he says, when you give advice to people, or when you are teaching in such a way, or you're giving irshad, ta'lim wal irshad, you are also transmitting a certain kind of your own madhab to the other person you're learning. And the third meaning of madhab, he says, is when you do your own research, النظر والتحقيق.
تذهب إليه. ذهبت إلى هذا.
Yeah, exactly. No, but he says, but you must be attentive. He says, what he's showing is that the question of madhab is not free from cultural, social, and other institutions. You can't run away. You can't run away from your skin. You can't run away from your tribe. You can't run away from your language. You can't run away from your environment. You are made in that. Yes, sometimes you can lessen the influence of your environment and your ethnicity and so on and so forth with knowledge, but it's there. But then a very interesting thing he says, when people want to create some political trouble, he says, what do? The Ahlul Riyasa and the people of politics, they make you argue which one is the better madhab. He says they go so far, they make you, the people, debate whether what is the good flag, the black flag or the white flag. He says this is all the game they're playing with you, right? All the game playing with you. And then he says something very interesting. He says basically madhab can mean is multiple things. Madhab is not the singular thing. But he says most people think that madhab is only one. And he says it's impossible to argue with people who believe like that the madhab is only one. And he says they will not be the first people to go into halak because of their stupidity. But he says it's no point arguing with them because they have been told madhab is only one thing. So for Ghazali, a madhab, in my view, is a discursive tradition. In other words, a madhab is an argument about knowledge. How you argue about knowledge. That's what madhab means. Madhab doesn't mean you have solid positions. It's the way you construct your knowledge. Is your knowledge construction, your knowledge performance, your epistemology, your ontology, and those kind of questions, and that the questions of what's in. Therefore, in the end of the book, he says, that وجانب الالتفات to all these different people who are calling you to their madhab and so on, that you must become a sahib madhab. You must become a sahib madhab. Now, he's obviously meaning that for the khawas, but as you remember, Ghazali says that even a layperson is not with the jamhur here. He's got the marjuh opinion that even a layperson, a army, must do some level of ijtihad. How? That if you decide you have 3 scholars that you're going to consult, you must do some effort to say, how is this scholar? How is that scholar? How is that scholar? He says it's the same that if you go into a town and you're trying to find a good doctor, you're going to ask around, how is this doctor? How is that doctor? Then you're going to make up opinion, okay, I'm choosing that. That is your level of ijtihad, right? So Ghazali says even an ammi must do some element of self-discernment in order to decide which scholar you're going to refer to as your source of reference. So Ghazali is helping us a lot, because Ghazali want us as individuals to become self-mobilizing agents.
Very interesting, Professor. Reaching towards the end of this interesting interview, but I want to ask here, so إحياء علوم الدين, if you want to summarize it, or the core ethical concept that is manifested in إحياء علوم الدين in regards to تهذيب النفس, تطهير الروح, بناء الأخلاق, or gaining a certain ethical personality. So what's the core message of this book? And you've spent too much time with it. So how can you summarize the ethical philosophy of his message?
It is 3. I will summarize it in 3 words: adab, adab, and adab. The whole thing, the whole project is about adab. But adab means that practices must be internalized. That means become part of your malaka. And that these habits must be in such a way that it reaches the asma, the highest goals. In other words, practice and reflection, knowledge and reflection must result, every time you do it, must result in a higher output. You must be able to do it better. And therefore it requires tafaqquh and tafakkur. Ghazali is very big on that tafakkur and tafaqquh is central. And when your practice becomes better, the irfan, the light, will automatically come into your body. Your mind and your heart will be opened up. So it is about adab. It's about adab all throughout. It is nothing other than adab, because for Ghazali, adab is at the center of ta'deeb is at the center of everything. أدبني ربي فأحسن تأديبي. Right? So that is the core question. That is the core issue for Ghazali. And إحياء علوم الدين is all about adab. Yes, it goes into ilm, it goes into various, the arkan of Islam, various topics. But at the bottom of it, it is about how do you become a better person? How do you practice and become a better person? And your practice will create knowledge, and your knowledge will create practice. And it will be a continuously reinforcing process.
And he talks too much about how to get rid of all the bad vices and all the radha'il, and through the process of gaining bad faith.
So the practices themselves will take care of the negative elements. So it is about khulus, it's about ikhlas, check yourself, and so on and so forth. And as you practice, you will see that those negative traits will disappear. So it's all about developing what he calls the khisal in yourself, right? And these khisal, these traits within you, these temperaments within you that must be developed through practice. But what does adab do? Adab means that you must now be very self-conscious when you do the practice. So you can't just do salah and wudu and those things automatically on autopilot. You must do it with a certain level of conscientiousness. your friendship, I mean, the book of friendship is such a beautiful book. Amazing. I can't go into that discussion right now, but I would love to spend some time with you and talk to you. My reading of, Kitab al-Mahabba wal-Ishq. It's a beautiful way that he talks about, because that's what friendship is all about. But friendship is all about making your soul, making your heart. So we think friendship is, is that you have friends and we talk about it, but it also makes your soul better and creates love within you. And that love can be used in loving human beings, but also loving Allah, right? So that's what Ghazali is all about. Teaches us ordinary, basic practices that will make us better persons.
Even as البحث السماع والموسيقى is the most comprehensive, I think, between many different books of scholars.
Absolutely. On the discussion of music is beautiful.
Professor, one of your main concerns nowadays is the challenges of the modern world. So what do you think is the main challenges that is facing Islamic thought regarding many of the modern الإشكالات المعاصرة التي تطرح على الدين, and you've been working with maybe different groups and different people about this topic and in the Maidan?
In one sentence, the ulama al-Islam must deepen their knowledge of their deen and their turath, and they must deepen their knowledge of the dunya in which they are living, and make knowledge one thing, not two separate things. There's no knowledge of deen and knowledge of dunya, but it's one comprehensive understanding of knowledge. Otherwise, we are losing ourselves and we are destroying ourselves wherever we go in the Muslim world. Our societies are upset, and unfortunately, the ulama of deen are not making a contribution to the betterment of society, but rather are creating problems and conflict. And that is because of qillatul ilm. Qillatul ilm al-deen, qillatul ilm al-turath, qillatul ilm al-dunya. And ulama don't know how the modern world operates and what modern science is and what modern philosophy is. And that we have discovered many, many good things in modern world. And that is purely because we don't want to take the knowledge of the West as part of our turath. We think that our turath only goes back to Ghazali and to all the people that were Muslim. That's not true. Ghazali and other people thought that the Greeks and the Indians and everybody were part of their turath, and therefore they included it. Our problem today is that we are not thinking that knowledge of the past 400 or 500 years is also our knowledge. We're not thinking like that. We keep that knowledge separate. We will not bring that knowledge into a discussion of fiqh, of a discussion of ilm al-kalam, into a discussion of the ta'wil and tafsir, and with the result that we are not presenting a deen, understanding of deen, that works in this world. In fact, sometimes our understanding of deen might not even work in Ghazali's time. Because our concept of deen, many of our concepts of deen, we have not developed these concepts to the context in which we are living. Because the concepts of deen and fiqh, kalam, all these things are not jamid, they are not static, they are dynamic. They must be re-understood. So when you ask me the question, how can Ghazali from Faisalul al-Tafraqah help us? That means a lot of Ghazali's concepts must be reconceptualized, new concept must be made based on new knowledge. Our problem is that we kept on saying we're going back to old knowledge. And we kept on saying we're doing ijtihad. Both Sunnis and Shias, they're doing ijtihad. And my Shia friends say they do ijtihad. I tell them, but your ijtihad is not giving me better answers.
They do ijtihad backward, not forward.
Doing ijtihad backwards. Because the ijtihad they're doing ijtihad on own nusus. They find some nas, some text. The text is giving them an opening. They say, oh, the problem was solved already by Mullah Sadra or by Mullah so-and-so. But the question is, you have ignored the knowledge of your time. Now, just because you did not produce that knowledge, you now think that knowledge is the knowledge of enemies. But Mullah Sadra did not think that Greek knowledge is the knowledge of enemies. Ghazali didn't think so. Ibn Sina did not think so. Al-Farabi didn't think so. Kindi did not think so. The Greeks were Wathaniyun. They were idolaters. But you took their philosophy. Why are you so resistant to modern knowledge? modern science, psychology, questions of anthropology, sociology, understanding the world, how the world operates. That's separate from the knowledge of philosophy and the question of science. So ulama are not part of that game. في الشرق والغرب حتى العلماء في الغرب يتقوقعون. The ulama in the West were trained in the East and so on. They're not doing anything better. This is our biggest challenge. This is the biggest challenge. And I pray to Allah that in this month of Ramadan, we will do some work to encourage young people to study broadly, to open up their eyes. And because al-ilmu la madhaba lahu. Al-ilmu la madhaba lahu. Knowledge doesn't have a religion. Al-ilmu la dina lahu. Afwan. Al-ilmu la dina lahu. Al-ilmu ilmu. And unfortunately, we keep on looking at the latest knowledge that we have as materialistic, as bad knowledge, Western knowledge, and this is dangerous and will destroy Iman. No, you are destroying your Iman. Your kids and children are destroying their Iman on the very knowledge that you are taking. They are running away from Deen. They're running away because you can't explain the world to them. You can't explain them the Risala of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to them in a language that they can understand. That's the failure of the ulama.
Professor Ibrahim Musa, thank you very much for all this insight and knowledge.
جزاكم الله خير. Thank you for your time. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بارك الله فيك يا حبيبي.